Well, firstly, I'd like to just say how interesting the talks have been, because they make so many links between Warhol and Morris. And what I'm going to do is just give a little bit about Warhol's background and why this show, there's so many fascinating links in the show. So some of you may or may not know that Warhol's parents were born in Eastern Europe. And in fact, his mother was born in 1892 in a very small village, which was then part of the Austrian-Hungarian Revolution, Empire. And in fact, now was then Czechoslovakia and then became Slovakia. And it was a little tiny village with an agrarian culture. So she had been brought up on the land. So the whole talk about greenery, rather interesting, because then she joined her husband, who 10 years after she had married him, and went to Pittsburgh, which was the opposite of a green place at the time. In fact, an industrial steel city, and a place where, in fact, the smoke and the pollution billowed out into the city. And she is a very important part of Andy Warhol's life, and I want to talk a little bit about her, and I'm going to start with playing a story, a little bit of a story that she would tell to Warhol when he was a little boy. He was one of 3. He had 2 elder brothers, and the story is a little folk tale about money. And what is interesting for Julia is that many of her tales were about either money or often loss. So people that went somewhere and disappeared. Story about a pocketbook that will always give you money. Of course, one of the things that the young Warhol family had was not a great deal of money, and in fact Andy's father died when he was 14, a quite traumatic time for him. But let's look back to some of the kind of early traumas that Warhol had. And one of them was that his mother told him to say when he went to school, and there's quite a lot written about Warhol's early schooling, that he was Carpatho-Rusyn, and the children at school would say to him, "Oh, you're Russian," and he found that rather troubling. But there's also a great deal has been written about Warhol's religious nature, and also why he made the themes of the work that he made. And this is the church where the Warhol family worshipped, and his John Warholer, his brother, outside the church in Pittsburgh. And this church was very, very particular. It was quite a long way from where the family's first house was in Orr Street. It was a little nearer their second house in Dawson Street. More of that later. And they had to walk quite a distance to the church. And on Sundays, they often went twice to church. And in this church is rather beautiful. As you approach it, it's got these very beautiful icons outside, these mosaics, which really glint in the sun. And Warhol's brothers told me that, you know, they would look up and see this beauty from a distance and know that they were nearing the church. So right from the beginning, he was exposed to these large icons that he would see, and this beautiful Byzantine church where his mother sang in the choir and also had candles and incense. And so he was much taken with both the grid nature of the saints and the gold and patination in the church itself. And as you can see, it was a very beautiful church. But what of this beginnings of Warhol? So he was born in 1928. And this is a mirror image of the house where Warhol was born. This is in Orr Street, which was a very poor area. But his father saved money. And this was very important because what the brothers said was that a lot of the men in the area would go drinking, they would go spending their money, but Warhol's father didn't do that, Andrei Warhol. He did not do that. And he bought a house in Dawson Street when Andy was 6, and this is the house that's now lived in by the nieces of Andy Warhol. And this house had a back garden that was very important, a backyard, but actually it was a garden where Warhol grew flowers. And he did an early painting there when he was at college of the Dawson Street room. And this painting is it's owned by the Warhol family, and it's actually very interesting because it's a reverse of the inside of the house. So either he took a photograph possibly and reversed it, but it is the fireplace is the other way round in the actual house itself. But in this picture you can see the cross, and Warhol was brought up in, as I say, a religious way. And his mother, who was a very spirited woman, but never, as you heard from her voice, really embraced the American culture in a way. She always wrote back to her sisters in what she called the old country, and she became Warhol's huge support and also was partly responsible for his first factory in the house, where she used to do drawing competitions with the children and later would write on his books for him that he produced, and also his sketches and drawings. But something else she also taught him was to make these ornate eggs, these ostrich eggs. And this is a later drawing that he did one of this. And Warhol used to give eggs, as did his brothers, to friends at Easter. And eggs also played quite a big role in the family because Warhol became fascinated by many of Julia's stories, which were about milking cows, giving cows grass, feeding the chickens and getting the eggs from the chicken coop when she was back in Mikover. And in fact, Warhol became fascinated by kind of mass production and of course did his cow wallpaper and also some other series of eggs. But when he was 8, he became very ill with some vitus dance, with cholera. And at that point, he started to get not only fascinated by movie stars, but also cut out paper doll books. And a theme he revisits in some drawings later, some of his famous inked works. And what was interesting about these cut-out dolls, he had one particular book that he didn't cut out, it was so precious for him, which was his Charlie McCarthy cut-out paper doll book. And he would sit there kind of forcing himself not to cut these dolls out to keep them intact. But Warhol was always very interested in reproduction in all its different manifestations. Rubber stamping, photography, Polaroids, which he did numerous Polaroids of, recording. And we don't have any really other example of an artist that produced so much in so many different media. In fact, in the philosophy, he says that when he heard that Picasso had made 4,000 paintings in his lifetime and they were all masterpieces, he wanted to make 4,000 in a day. It was a throwaway comment, but however quite serious in many ways, because Warhol understood and believed that one way to keep yourself from death in a way was to put as much out there as you could in as many different media as you could. But when we start dealing with Warhol, what happens is that we find how very inventive he is with every subject. So eggs, he goes into a supermarket. By this time, his mother is dead. He's remembering the traditional eggs he'd made and painted as a child and had been the subject of some of his illustrations. And he makes a whole series of Polaroids of eggs, but not eggs neatly in their 12 eggs neatly in a box, but kind of all spread out, and does them in multicolours. And food. So for Warhol, food was also very important. And Julia, throughout the 50s, used to send food parcels back to Eastern Europe. Now, in 1949, Warhol actually left Pittsburgh and went to live permanently in New York. His mother joined him in 1952. And there is a whole fascinating story about that, leaving this industrial city. He had been to New York before to live in New York and make a huge success of being a commercial illustrator, not really embracing the fine art world until 1960-61. But his mother, because he wasn't married and the two other boys had got married, decided that she would go and live with him, and which she did. But what she set up in the house that their first house they had, was a kind of little regime where she lived there, and she used to give him his orange juice in the morning, and she used to make tape recordings to send to her grandchildren and also to people in Eastern Europe. And she also was always sending postcards, and the postcards were often religious icons and also lovely greetings cards. And we have many examples in the archives of these beautiful greetings cards that Julia Warhol kept and saved. And then after her death in 1972, Warhol couldn't really cope with his mother's death. That's a whole nother story. But he took all the things that she had left in his house. When she didn't actually die in the house, she'd gone back to Pittsburgh before she died. He took all the things and put them in a box, one of his time capsules. And this is very moving because it's full of her clothes, her little apron, her hats, and also all these cards. And you start to see an interesting sensibility. She collected many, many cards of hearts. And of course, there's a wonderful example in the show upstairs of a hand with a heart perched on the finger so beautifully. But also many, many works of flowers. And flowers, as we've already heard, and as Jeremy spoke about, were very important to Warhol, both cultivating them. Now, I've had different stories from the family. Some say he grew pansies, some say he grew nasturtiums, some say he grew daisies, but he definitely grew flowers in his back garden. And many of his early illustrations are of flowers. And this is an interesting one because this is where he's using a stamp to stamp the actual make the image of the flowers with a reproduction. So Warhol and reproduction, where did it start and what's it all about? Why was he so fascinated in reproduction? Well, firstly, he was living in a city where he was surrounded, if you like, by things made, this industrial city. But also he did, as has been suggested, want to get himself out there. He wanted to share his work, and one way was to reproduce it. But when we look at some of these early works, they are really fascinating. This is children watching TV. And of course, what you'll notice here is an absence of the TV. Now, Warhol was not brought up in the television age. As I say, he was born in 1928. And in fact, the family, when they got the first radio, which the family still have, Warhol became fascinated by the radio and, as is shown very well upstairs, fascinated by Hollywood and Hollywood stars and going to the cinema. And there were 3 cinemas actually in Pittsburgh where he could go and watch films, and also could buy little film stills of the stars of the day. So I think it's interesting that the television is missing here. Warhol also based most of his illustrations, almost all, there are some he didn't, on actual photographs, some taken by his boyfriend in the 50s, Edward Wolowitz, and some actually that he would take from books in the New York Library. And I interviewed at one point a guy called John Soane who was working at the library at the time, and he said they kept finding these books with bits taken, cut out of them, and some of those are in the archives. They've actually got the picture that was cut out of the books. Warhol knew that books were important, but he used them in a very specific way. Not only did he use them for the illustration purposes, when he used to go and see clients, he would often give them an actual little book to remember him by, often printing these books in little reproduction parties in his first shared accommodation in New York, where he would get friends to come in, particularly people like Philip Pearlstein, who he had gone to New York with, to come, and he would basically make, using his blotted line technique, which is this folded sheet of paper with tracing paper where you trace the image and then ink it and then blot it so you get a double image. And then he would give people certain tasks. So some people would put the pink on the drawing or etc. So it was this kind of first factory. But also the idea of this gold. And the gold book is a rather interesting example, in fact, of work where he made a print run of 100 copies, and 17 of the 19 drawings in the book are based on photographs. It was a promotional book to give to clients, and it's the first book he actually makes where he just credits himself alone. He made lots of other books, including books with his mother. His mother, and that's a whole another story. She was a wonderful, wonderful drawer, and she made many drawings, but they were always of the same subject matter: cats, angels, and the occasional dog. And these angels that she drew were quite extraordinary because their wings were often so drawn in and so kind of swirled that these were angels that could have never flown. And many of the illustrations that she kept of icon angels have these enormous wings that, of course, they would never have been able to fly. The wings are bigger than really is possible to have been a flying being. But also, let's also look at Warhol and language as well. And this is a very fascinating work because this is Andy Warhol's crossword from 1961. And you'll see there's lots of loss in the words. And this erasure of things becomes very fascinating because one of the things about Warhol was when he went to Pittsburgh, when he went to New York from Pittsburgh, he kind of erased his Pittsburgh roots. His Pittsburgh roots were in his home with his mother, but they didn't cross-translate. They were not in the factory. His interest in religion, he did go to church in New York, was there, but not his actual Eastern European mother. Some people met his mother. David Bailey met his mother. The family used to come up and stay, his two brothers and their children. So Paul Warhol had 7 children and John had 3 children. They would come up in the summer and stay, but actually he kept the two worlds separately. And also his mother would often speak to him in what was called the old language as well. So often there was this kind of, he refused to speak back to her in Rusyn. However, in some of there's a wonderful film later on of his mother sleeping shortly before she dies, where he is actually answering her back. So, Mrs. Warhol, wonderful film, 1966. He actually films his mother in this rather fantastic film, actually. And you can see how lively she is and how interesting. And she films him with Warhol's then boyfriend, Richard Ream. And she's doing all the things she would normally do in the house. So she scrambles eggs for Richard. She teaches him how to iron underwear. And the plot is this loose plot that has been married many times and she's poisoned her husband. And it's a kind of funny little relationship between Andy Warhol's mother, who really adored this boyfriend of Warhol, and Warhol behind the camera. But it also shows her in her own domestic setting, and she's talking away and she's flirting with the camera, and it's just a lovely film. And there are lots, as I say, lots of images of Julia in the archives, and I find this relationship between her and her Pittsburgh and Eastern European roots and Warhol's New York, and of course the silver factory then, which is then developed from 63 to 1968. Very fascinating. And one of the most haunting portraits probably that he made was of his mother in 1974, 2 years after she died, where he scrumbles on the paint with his fingers and makes her into a kind of hologram, resonating out. He made 4 portraits of her. But let's look back a little bit to some of his interest in Hollywood, because of course we all know the Marilyns and the wonderful photograph upstairs of Shirley Temple. And this is of Troy Donahue, who was a particular interest to Warhol as he was a teen idol, a male teen idol, who girls allegedly used to faint in the cinema when they saw him on screen. And Warhol used to collected many photographs of him and made his first works of him using a fabricated rubber stamp rather than a later silkscreen, which this one is. And in Popism, he talks of making this work, and he says it was quick and chancy, the screen printing process. And some of my first experiments were with Troy Donahue. He also did this portrait as well, which is probably familiar to you if you know the Marilyn ones. And he had clipped out something from the paper, which is Troy talking, where he says, "I guess it's because I'm blonde, blue-eyed and tanned. People associated me with all those beach movies that were around then, even though I never did one." And he later said, "I was always the goody-goody, the guy who did what he was supposed to." But there were other parts of identification that Warhol found with him, just as he identified with Shirley Temple, because she was the same age as him, and there were other reasons. She was blonde at a time when he felt he was losing his cuteness, and he was very fascinated with how she was always in the film with all these older men dancing. But also, Troy had lost his father when he was 14, and Warhol kind of identified with that and avidly read these fan magazines, which explained about his life. But also relating to gold and icons is Warhol's Gold Marilyn of 1962, which immediately preceded Warhol's works on death. And he said at the time to Art News in November 1963, after he'd finished this series, I was painting the death and disaster and realised that everything I was doing must have been about death. And he began doing silk screens of Marilyn Monroe very shortly after she had died. And you probably know that they were based on a still from the film Niagara, which had been made 10 years before. And that film itself was a rather fascinating film, because in it, Marilyn Monroe plays a character. She's a temptress, and she plays a character where she's trying to lure her lover, her husband, to be killed by her lover at the Niagara Falls. And she's called Rose Loomis in the film, and she's very seductive in it, but also it's all about love. It's also about the identity, because in the end it is in fact her husband who kills the lover, not the other way round. And the shoes, he picks up the shoes, so they think that it is the husband who is actually dead. Now, that relates back to many of the stories that Warhol used to be told by his mother about identity. Now, I'm going to have to move a little bit quicker. Where is your rupture? Well, these are very interesting series, because in Pittsburgh, because of the heavy industry, not only were the surgeries often full with people with hernias and ruptures, also Warhol himself later suffered a hernia, which in fact they didn't repair when he was shot, but repaired in his final operation, which he actually died from complications from. But also his mother developed cancer and had a colostomy bag, and that also quite affected Warhol and his brothers. They were very upset. They felt it was unnecessary. This is the photo booth machine, actually it's installed in the Warhol Museum, but it's like the ones that Warhol would have used to make many of his reproductions. But Warhol never really gave up on the kind of home scene. On Sundays, he would still go to church in New York. He also worked giving out food to the poor, even on Christmas Day, which is recorded in his diaries. And the last series of works he did were the Fright Wigs and the Last Supper series, reanimating a postcard which his mother had put in the house. Now, in fact, stories vary on this. The brothers say she framed and the brothers are now dead, in fact, but when I interviewed them, they said that she framed the Last Supper and had it up on the mantelpiece, above the mantelpiece, and then took it with her when she went to New York to be with Andy. Other sources say that Warhol picked up a card from just a cheap reproduction card. Whatever it was, he became obsessed with making many, many different versions of the Last Supper, including this one, the Big C, which of course has so many resonances with Warhol, both the whole thing of culture, Christ, pop culture, the big C, cancer, all these things. He packs into this work in a quite mesmerizing way, I think, all these different things, because Warhol is always, there's so much more behind what he does, although his claims to surface are in fact quite the opposite. And again, his series of crosses, and he had 12 crosses in his house in New York, and one of them was made all out of little coins, in fact. So really, I'm almost at the end of my time. Warhol never, ever rejected in his art his Eastern European background from his parents. He was extremely talented at art, and he used to go to art classes in a huge hall where there were 1,000 other children learning to draw. And you would have thought for a shy boy, because he started those lessons when he was a young teenager, he was only 11 when he started them, it would have been traumatic for him to be sometimes picked up as the best in the class and have to go and speak about his work. But somehow he managed it. So his desire to get his work out, his desire to be the best, was really important. Now, his brothers have talked very eloquently about him. This is some photographs I took. Anne Warhol there, Paul Warhol's wife, is still alive, and she talks about going to Pittsburgh and cleaning and kind of going to church with Julia Warhol. But going to their houses was fascinating because they collected so many things. Paul Warhol had a recycling plant now taken over by his son, Marty. And this is Marty's scrapyard. And I just wanted to show you a picture of the fridge in Marty Warhol's recycling plant. And looking at it was like a kind of extraordinary kind of little retrospective of Warhol's interests. But this collecting mentality, this saving of things, whether it be a can that you fashioned into flowers, whether it be making sure, I mean, one of the extraordinary things in the Julia box is lots of plastic bags which were used to put carrots in. And he saved them, Warhol saved them. He saved a little piece of tissue that had this strange, it was just a piece of kitchen roll really, but it had this lovely little blue design on it. So in a way, this thriftiness, this looking after things, this keeping things, this not throwing things away, this recycling, but also the elements of having that religious background, going to church, seeing those icons, stayed with Warhol his entire life. Okay, and there's now a live link to Warhol's grave from the in Pittsburgh. You can now go and see a live link into the museum of Andy's grave, and you can see who's there and what they're doing, whether they're placing cans on the grave or just paying homage to him. Okay, and it's in an Eastern European cemetery. Walking around the cemetery, it's above Pittsburgh. There are all these Eastern European names in the graveyard. Thank you.